At the very moment I stood to celebrate my sister's joy, she turned the spotlight into my humiliation. The laughter of the crowd pierced deeper than knives. But then, when her groom rose to speak, the entire hall fell into a silence none of us would ever forget. The wedding hall sparkled with life, every corner filled with laughter, music, and the bright colors of traditional attire. Women swayed in their vibrant dresses, men in sharp suits, children running around with smiles as wide as the horizon. The air carried the scent of food, flowers, and celebration. It was a day that promised joy, a day where every heart seemed to beat in rhythm with the drums. Among the crowd sat Lindayo, her dress simple but neat, her hands resting nervously on her lap. She was the elder sister of the bride, and though her life had been filled with quiet sacrifices, today she was determined to wear her best smile. Her eyes followed Ayanda, glowing in her bridal gown, surrounded by love and admiration. Lindayo's heart swelled with pride. Her younger sister had finally found happiness, and that alone was enough to make her own struggles seem worth it. She clapped along to the songs, nodded politely at relatives who teased her gently about being next, and tried to hide the nervous flutter in her chest. This was not her day. It was Ayanda's moment, and Lindayo wanted nothing more than to blend into the background, to witness and celebrate. She adjusted her dress, brushing off a faint trace of dust no one else noticed, silently praying everything would go smoothly. The stage shone with light, and the bride and groom sat like royalty, receiving blessings, gifts, and endless praise. Lindayo's heart carried a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, she would share a small piece of this happiness. She imagined giving her speech, saying a few words of love for her sister, thanking the family, and then returning to her seat with dignity. But as she glanced at Ayanda, radiant and smiling at her guests, a flicker of doubt touched her chest. Something in her sister's gaze felt sharper than the smile she wore. Still, Lindayo dismissed it, choosing instead to focus on the music, the laughter, and the joyous chaos filling the hall. After all, this was a day for love, not for worries. Little did she know, the celebration she had come to honor would soon twist into something unforgettable, something that would leave the hall in stunned silence. The moment for speeches arrived, and the crowd cheered as the bride stood up, her smile wide and her voice full of energy. Everyone expected words of gratitude, words that would celebrate love and family. But instead, Ayanda gripped the microphone with a sparkle in her eye that was far from gentle. At first, her words seemed playful, but within seconds, the tone shifted. Her laughter cut sharper than glass, and her jokes began to slice through the room like blades. She turned her gaze toward Lindayo, her own sister, and with a mocking grin said, "Not everyone here is lucky enough to find love. Some people just watch from the sidelines, waiting and waiting, but who knows if their time will ever come." The hall erupted with laughter. Guests clapped their hands, shaking their heads, thinking it was all in good fun. But to Lindayo, every laugh was a knife to the chest. Ayanda didn't stop there. She leaned closer to the microphone, her voice louder, her words heavier. She made comments about Lindayo's job struggles, about how she still lived modestly while others moved forward. She even hinted at past failures, things Lindayo had buried deep inside, things only a sister should have kept safe. The room, instead of protecting her, turned into a stage of humiliation. Friends of Ayanda howled with laughter, some pointing, some whispering, their eyes glued to Lindayo as if she were a joke meant to be consumed. Lindayo tried to smile, tried to convince the crowd she wasn't hurt, but her heart was cracking beneath the weight of the mockery. Her hands trembled in her lap, her throat tightened, and her eyes burned with tears she fought to hold back. The more she tried to disappear into the chair, the louder the laughter grew, echoing in her ears like thunder. She glanced around the hall, searching for one face that might defend her, one person who might stop the cruelty, but all she saw were amused eyes and entertained grins. It felt as if the entire world had turned against her in that moment. What was meant to be a celebration of love had become a public trial of her life, with her sister standing proudly as the judge and the crowd cheering as the jury. And still, Ayanda smiled, basking in the applause, as if her sister's pain was the highlight of her wedding day. Lindayo sat frozen in her chair, her lips curled into a smile that did not reach her eyes. On the outside, she appeared calm, even amused, but inside, her heart was breaking into pieces. Each laugh around her echoed like a cruel reminder that she was standing alone, stripped of dignity in a room full of people who should have known better. She tried to swallow the lump in her throat, but her chest tightened as though a heavy stone rested upon it. As Ayanda's words replayed in her mind, memories began to surface, flashes of moments that told a very different story. She remembered the nights she stayed awake, studying under a flickering lamp after long hours of work, so she could tutor Ayanda and help her pass her exams. She remembered the day she gave up her own scholarship abroad, because their parents could only afford to send one child, and she chose her sister's future over her own. The sacrifice had been quiet, hidden from the world, but to Lindayo it was worth it, because Ayanda's success had always felt like her own victory. Her mind drifted to the countless times she reached into her small savings to cover Ayanda's debts, slipping money into her hand without ever asking for it back. She thought about the extra shifts she worked, long nights where her legs ached and her eyes burned, just so Ayanda could have a better dress, a better life, a chance to live comfortably while she bore the weight. All of it had been given with love, never once expecting gratitude, never once demanding recognition. And yet, here she was, mocked for the very things she had chosen to give away. The crowd laughed at her singleness, her simplicity, her struggles, not knowing that Ayanda's comfort had been carved out of her sister's exhaustion. Lindayo forced her lips to stretch wider, blinking back the tears threatening to spill, because she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. But inside, her soul screamed, her sacrifices twisting into sharp thorns that pierced deeper with every cruel chuckle. As the music and laughter continued around her, she felt small, invisible, like the world had forgotten her worth. But somewhere in the silence of her pain, her heart whispered that truth has a way of revealing itself. Even if the world chooses to laugh for now, the hall was still buzzing with laughter, but beneath the noise came a softer, sharper sound, whispers. They slipped through the crowd like snakes, curling around Lindayo's ears no matter how hard she tried to block them out. Some relatives leaned toward each other, shaking their heads with pity. Shame. Poor Lindayo, she's still alone. One aunt murmured, her voice low but heavy with judgment. Another replied, at her age, who will even marry her now? Their words weren't meant for Lindayo to hear, yet every syllable reached her heart as if it had been spoken directly to her face. Others weren't so kind. A group of Ayanda's friends, dressed in glittering gowns, covered their mouths as they laughed, whispering cruel jokes behind painted nails. Imagine being the older sister, but having nothing to show for it. One sneered, her eyes flicking toward Lindayo with mockery. Another added, she should be the one serving food here, not sitting among us. Their laughter, sharp and ugly, stung more than Ayanda's words because it carried the sting of truth twisted into shame. Everywhere she turned, Lindayo felt eyes on her, some filled with pity, others with ridicule. She could sense the shift in the room, how her name had suddenly become the evening's entertainment. Even children, picking up on the energy of the adults, pointed toward her with innocent giggles, not understanding the cruelty of what they mimicked. The humiliation pressed down like a heavy cloak, suffocating her until even the air felt too thick to breathe. She lowered her gaze, pretending to fix her dress, pretending not to notice, but her ears could not unhear. If only she tried harder, maybe she'd have a man by now, someone muttered behind her. Another chuckled, she's probably cursed, that's why nothing works for her. Each whisper piled onto the next, until it became a chorus of unseen voices tearing away at her dignity. Lindayo sat still, her body stiff, her heart racing. She wanted to run, to escape the stares and the whispers, but her feet refused to move. She forced herself to sit tall, though inside, she was crumbling. The very family and friends who should have lifted her in love were now burying her in shame. And through it all, Ayanda sat proudly, basking in her spotlight, as if her sister's humiliation was the perfect accessory to her perfect day. Ayanda was still holding the microphone, her laughter echoing across the hall as she prepared to throw yet another cruel joke. Her voice dripped with arrogance, her words sharp enough to wound, But before she could continue, something shifted in the air. At first, it was subtle, a stillness, a tension, as though the walls themselves were growing. Tired of her mockery. And then, all eyes turned to the groom. Saipho rose slowly from his chair, his tall frame casting a shadow over the glowing bride beside him. His expression was not the warm smile everyone had seen earlier, but a storm waiting to break. His jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on Ayanda with a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. The chatter in the crowd began to fade as guests noticed the change. Laughter softened into uneasy murmurs. Forks and glasses stilled in midair. Ayanda's grin faltered for the first time that night. She tried to brush it off, nudging him playfully as if to say it was all harmless fun, but Saipho did not respond. Instead, he lifted his hand, firm, commanding, steady. The simple gesture carried a weight that no one dared ignore. The hall, once filled with mocking laughter and whispers, grew quiet. Slowly, the sound drained out of the room until only silence remained. Even the children stopped fidgeting, their small eyes watching with curiosity. The silence was heavy, pressing down on every corner of the hall. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what was about to happen. Ayanda clutched the microphone tighter, her smile now trembling at the edges, as though she sensed that something was slipping out of her control. Lindayu, still seated, lifted her eyes for the first time in a long while, watching Saipho with quiet surprise. In that silence, one thing became clear: this was no longer Ayanda's stage. The laughter that had burned Lindayu moments ago had died out, replaced by an air of suspense that made every heartbeat sound louder. Saipho stood tall, his presence demanding respect without a single word. The bride's cruelty had reached its peak, but now the tide was turning, and the entire hall could feel it. What came next would not be laughter, it would be truth. Saipho stepped forward, his movements calm but filled with authority, and gently took the microphone from Ayanda's hand. His eyes no longer held the warmth of a groom on his wedding day. They carried a weight that silenced even the boldest whispers in the crowd. When he spoke, his voice was steady, deep, and commanding. "Enough," he said, the words slicing through the silence like a blade. "This mockery ends here." The room held its breath. Guests leaned forward, some clutching their glasses, others exchanging nervous glances. Ayanda tried to smile, as if to dismiss his seriousness, but Saipho didn't even look at her. Instead, his gaze swept over the crowd, then rested on Lindayu, who sat still, her eyes wide with shock. "You laugh at her," he continued, his tone calm but sharp. "But do you know the truth? Do you know that the very reason Ayanda is standing here today in her gown, in this hall, is because of the woman you've just mocked?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd, heads turning toward Lindayu. Saipho's voice grew firmer, more passionate, each word carrying the weight of truth. He spoke of the years Lindayu worked tirelessly, sacrificing her own dreams so Ayanda could study. He told them how she covered her sister's debts, how she paid bills in silence, and how every step Ayanda took toward success was paved with her elder sister's sweat and tears. While Ayanda chased comfort, Saipho declared, it was Lindayu who carried the burden. She gave when she had nothing. She built when she had no strength left. And today you laugh at her. The hall was frozen, the same mouths that once laughed now hanging open in disbelief. Lindayu lowered her gaze, her face burning, not from shame this time, but from the sudden exposure of truths she had never intended to reveal. Saipho's voice softened as he turned directly to her. "You are the reason this day exists. Without you, none of us would be here celebrating." Ayanda shifted uneasily beside him, her smile gone, her hands trembling as she clutched her gown. The applause that had filled the hall earlier was replaced with heavy silence, every guest waiting, stunned, as the truth settled like a stone in their hearts. Saipho had not just defended Lindayu, he had honored her, lifting her higher in one moment than years of sacrifice ever had. Saipho paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the hall, his grip firm on the microphone. The silence was so heavy that even the clinking of a spoon on a plate would have sounded like thunder. Then, with a calm but cutting tone, he spoke again. "But there is something else you all deserve to know. While this woman mocked her sister, painting herself as perfect, she has been living behind a mask. The words sent a shiver through the room. Guests leaned closer, their curiosity mixed with dread. Ayanda stiffened, her face paling as she tried to interrupt, but Saifo raised his hand, silencing her without effort. "She stands before you as a bride," he continued, his voice unshaken. "But what many of you don't know is that Ayanda has betrayed not only her family, but this marriage itself. She has lied, manipulated, and played games behind closed doors." The hall gasped, sharp and collective, as though the air had been sucked out at once. Heads turned, eyes widened, and whispers broke out like sparks in dry grass. Saifo's voice did not waver. He began to reveal the secrets Ayanda thought would stay hidden. He spoke of the late-night calls she made to another man, the secret meetings that were covered with excuses, the deceit woven into every story she told her parents to gain their favor. While her sister broke her back to build her life, he said firmly, Ayanda was busy destroying her own with lies. Ayanda's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes darting across the hall as though searching for an escape. She stammered, "That's not true. He's lying," but the tremble in her voice betrayed her. Saifo pulled out his phone, his eyes never leaving hers. "I wish I were lying," he said coldly, "but the evidence says otherwise." The guests erupted in shocked murmurs, some covering their faces, others shaking their heads in disbelief. A woman in the front row gasped loudly, and an elder uncle muttered, "Hi, God have mercy." The laughter that once filled the hall had died completely, replaced by tension so sharp it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. Lindayo sat motionless, her heart pounding, unable to believe what she was hearing. This was no longer about humiliation, it was about truth exposing itself, and Ayanda's carefully built crown beginning to crumble before everyone's eyes. Ayanda let out a shaky laugh, forcing a smile as her eyes darted nervously around the hall. "Come on, everyone," she said, trying to wave it off like a harmless joke. "He's just teasing. You know how Saifo is, always dramatic." Her voice cracked as she spoke, and though she tried to sound confident, her hands betrayed her, fidgeting with the microphone and tugging at her gown. The guests, however, were no longer smiling. Their faces were stiff, their eyes piercing into her, waiting for what would come next. Saifo's expression did not soften. Without another word, he pulled out his phone and scrolled with precision. Then, with a steady hand, he held it up for the nearest guests to see. Screenshots of messages glowed brightly, flirty conversations with another man, promises Ayanda had no business making while planning a wedding. Gasps rippled across the hall, mouths opening wide in disbelief. One woman covered her chest with her hand, whispering, "No, not at her wedding." As Ayanda reached forward, trying to snatch the phone, Saifo stepped back, his voice sharp and controlled. "Don't even try to deny it. Here are the receipts, literally." From his pocket, he pulled folded papers. Receipts from expensive dinners, gifts purchased secretly, trips explained to family as work commitments. The evidence piled against her, tangible and undeniable. The once laughing crowd now turned restless, their whispers no longer harmless chatter, but heavy judgment. "So it's true," one relative muttered, shaking his head. "All this time, she fooled us?" Another sighed deeply, disgust etched into her face. The same mouths that cheered for Ayanda minutes ago now frowned, their admiration melting into scorn. Ayanda's face crumbled. The glow that had made her shine moments earlier dimmed as tears welled in her eyes. She shook her head desperately, pleading with trembling words, "It's not what it looks like. I can explain, please listen." But her voice was drowned out by the weight of the evidence, by the eyes of every guest who once celebrated her now staring with disappointment and shame. Her hands shook as she clutched her gown, her crown of pride slipping invisibly before everyone's eyes. She had tried to bury her sister in humiliation, yet now it was she who stood exposed, stripped of dignity, her carefully crafted image collapsing piece by piece. The whispers grew louder, heavier, and Ayanda could no longer hide. She was no longer the star of the night. She was the scandal. The hall was still buzzing with murmurs, the air heavy with shock and judgment, when Saifo shifted his focus. His gaze softened as it landed on Lindayo, who sat quietly in her chair, her eyes lowered, unsure of where to look. For so long she had been invisible, her sacrifices unnoticed, her worth unspoken. But now, in front of everyone, Saifo's voice rose again, not in anger this time, but in deep respect. "Well, Ayanda mocked her sister tonight," he said, his words carrying across the silent hall. "Let me tell you who Lindau truly is." The room stilled again, every ear waiting. Saifo's voice grew steadier, filled with emotion. "This woman is not weak. She is not a failure. She is the reason Ayanda stands here in her gown. She is the reason this wedding was even possible. If there is anyone who deserves honor tonight, it is Lindau." Gasps echoed softly, and eyes began to turn toward her, no longer in pity or mockery, but with new respect. Lindau's heart raced, her chest tight, tears pricking her eyes as Saifo continued. He told them how she had worked extra hours, how she gave up her own dreams, how she carried burdens that were never hers to carry. His words painted a truth so clear that no one could deny it. Lindau was the pillar, the silent strength that had held everything together. Then Saifo did something no one expected. He stepped down from the stage and walked toward Lindau, his every step echoing loudly in the hall. When he reached her, he gently took her hand and lifted her to her feet. His eyes met hers, steady and filled with respect, and he spoke words that made the entire hall fall silent. "Today, the world sees who the real jewel of this family is." The guests, once laughing at her humiliation, now erupted into applause. The same mouths that had whispered cruel things were now cheering her name, their eyes shining with admiration. Lindau stood there trembling, overwhelmed, her hand still in Saifo's, her heart caught between disbelief and relief. For the first time in her life, she wasn't hidden in the shadows of sacrifice. She was finally seen, honored, and lifted high for the world to recognize her true worth. Ayanda's face was flushed with rage and shame, her carefully painted smile now shattered beyond repair. The whispers had grown too loud, the stares too sharp, and the walls of the hall seemed to close in on her. Clutching her gown, she let out a frustrated cry, dropped the microphone, and stormed out of the hall, her heels clattering angrily against the floor. Guests parted silently to make way for her, their eyes following her with judgment and disbelief. What was supposed to be her perfect day had turned into a nightmare, collapsing in front of everyone she had wanted to impress. The music had stopped, the laughter had died, and the grand celebration was left hanging in ruins. The bride's seat sat empty, a crown with no head to wear it. For a moment, the room was thick with silence, until the sound of clapping began to rise, slow at first, then stronger, until the hall filled with thunderous applause. But this time, the cheers were not for Ayanda. Every eye, every hand, every heart was turned toward Lindau. She stood there, her hand still trembling in Saifo's, her eyes moist with unshed tears. She had come into the wedding small and unnoticed, carrying only her love for her sister, but now she was standing tall in the spotlight, her dignity shining brighter than any jewel. Guests who had whispered cruelly about her earlier were now clapping with respect, their faces filled with regret for not seeing her worth before. Some even stood from their seats, offering her the standing ovation that Ayanda had once craved. Lindau took a deep breath and slowly lifted her head, her smile gentle, but filled with strength. She did not gloat, she did not boast. She simply allowed herself to be seen, the way she should have been seen all along. In that moment, her silence spoke louder than any words, her quiet dignity more powerful than any crown. And as the applause echoed through the hall, a soft narration lingered in the air, wrapping her story with truth. She tried to bury me in shame, but truth lifted me higher than her crown ever could. It was not Ayanda's wedding anymore, it was Lindau's redemption, etched forever in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it. This story touched your heart. Don't just scroll away. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that truth always wins, and dignity always shines brighter than pride. Gemstone sparkles. Backhand index pointing right. Comment your thoughts below. What would you have done if you were Lindau? Backhand index pointing right. Share this to inspire others. Backhand index pointing right. Follow for more powerful stories that will keep you hooked till the very last word.